Well, good afternoon, everyone. Indigenous peoples are the traditional guardians of Turtle Island, the land also known as North America. We recognize their wisdom and their connection to the earth as its original stewards for time immemorial. The land within and surrounding present-day Wilmington are traditional territories of the Waccamaw, Catawba, and the Cape Fear people, as well as other peoples who have lived on these lands and whose histories have been marginalized. The Commission for Environmental Cooperation is committed to recognizing and promoting the respect of Indigenous peoples' rights, including the right to self-determination in environmental activities and decisions across North America. We acknowledge, respect, honor, and pay tribute to the history and the resilience of the community of Wilmington and of this region, where communities of many backgrounds have fought to revert historical and systemic injustices. It's an honor to be here at this crucial roundtable discussion on environmental justice, origins, evolution, and emerging policy in North America. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the CEC and its executive director, Daniel, for organizing this event and providing a comprehensive background paper that sets the stage for today's discussion. Environmental justice, as we know it today, has deep roots going back to the civil rights movements of the 1960s in the United States. Communities have long fought against environmental racism and discrimination, demanding equitable access to clean air, clean water, and clean land. Over the decades, the movement has expanded and evolved, incorporating diverse voices and addressing a broad range of challenges. The paper highlights key milestones of the evolution of environmental justice across North America, illustrating how community advocacy has led to significant policy and regulatory changes. Despite the progress made, many communities still face disproportionate environmental burdens. These challenges are compounded by the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. In the United States, we see these inequities manifesting in various forms: polluted air and water, exposure to hazardous waste, and increased vulnerability to climate impacts such as extreme heat and flooding. The discussion paper rightfully emphasizes the intersectional nature of environmental justice. Vulnerabilities are often layered, impacting communities based on race, ethnicity, income, geography, and other factors. This complexity, well, it requires a multifaceted approach to policy and a multifaceted approach to action. We must continue to employ an intersectional lens to understand and address these comprehensive and compounded vulnerabilities effectively. The United States EPA is committed to advancing environmental justice through a variety of initiatives. Our approach includes improving access to information, fostering meaningful public participation, and implementing specific environmental justice policies and programs. For example, the establishment of the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights aims to ensure that all of our policies and all of our actions are inclusive and equitable. Environmental justice is not confined by borders. Canada, Mexico, and the United States all have unique challenges and strengths. And by working together, we can develop more robust solutions to help and save more communities. The CEC plays a crucial role in facilitating this trilateral collaboration. Joint projects can help us share knowledge, develop more effective tools, and engage communities all across all of our countries. Looking ahead, we must prioritize actions that address both current and emerging environmental justice issues. This includes tackling climate-related vulnerabilities, ensuring equitable distribution of environmental benefits, and continuously constantly engaging with affected communities. Innovative policies, community-driven solutions, and enhanced legal frameworks will be essential in our ongoing efforts to achieve environmental justice. So folks, environmental justice must remain at the heart of all of our environmental policies and actions. The decisions we make today will shape the health and well-being of future generations. Please let us continue to work together. Let's continue to share experiences and expertise, and let's commit to a just and equitable future for all. I would like to recognize and thank the distinguished experts participating in today's discussion. Your insights and your expertise are invaluable as we navigate the complex landscape of environmental justice, and I'm delighted that you are here today dedicating your time and your intellectual capacity for this discussion. Thank you all, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Administrator Reagan, for your introductory words on the importance and evolution of environmental justice in North America. A few words of order for the meeting. The discussion during this panel will be recorded and will be used as inputs to improve the design and future work of the CEC on environmental justice. And Dr. Chavis, we are recording it, we're registering it, we're publishing it. Be sure of that. We will take questions online via Zoom and by paper during all of the discussion so that people can send in their questions by raising their hand. And the moderator, myself, will bring those questions into the discussions. There won't be a Q&A session at the end, so the questions will be taken as we are discussing. All questions will be answered, and this is something we do with the roundtable of the executive director. They come straight to me, and I will respond personally to every single question online or from the public that doesn't get answered. I'm honored to be here today with our panelists at such an important moment. Very distinguished set of panelists. First, Dr. Chavis. I'm not going to go through his presentation again. Lamisha did a great job of that earlier. I will say, though, he had such an important role in the 1991 summit. It was the first National People of Color's Environmental Leadership Summit. And I have the report here, and I was surprised to know that it's not really out there. People don't actually have a copy of it. And this is a problem. And this goes back to something I keep hearing. We need to publish. We need to publish information. We need information to be captured so that we can learn and move on. That summit led to the 17 principles of environmental justice, which are part of who we are and what we do today on this issue. Kenneth Martin. Kenneth is a citizen of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians and a descendant of the Menominee Nation in present-day Wisconsin. He is director of the American Indian Office, Environmental Office at the US EPA, and he's helping protect the health and the environment on federally recognized Indian tribes. Kenneth was the first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tribal Government Affairs at the US Department of Transportation. Kenneth, welcome. Amanda Montforton is Algonquin from the Pikwakanagan First Nation. She's Director of Policy Development with the Strategic Policy Branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. She's leading emerging policy development on environmental justice and gender-based analysis at such a critical time in Canada. You've heard Canada's just passed their environmental justice legislation. Ariel Deranger, Ariel, near the end over there. She's a member of the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation, and she's the founder of Indigenous Climate Change Action. We'll be talking more about the Indigenous dimensions of environmental justice. She is active in international Indigenous rights advocacy and has a lot to offer to this discussion. Welcome, Ariel. Marco Polo Huitron Bernaldez is Director of Attorney General's Office for Environmental Protection, the PROFEPA. This is the official agency in Mexico tasked with delivering environmental justice. So Marco Polo is here to give us the view of the Mexican government and the policy that's been developed to deliver access to justice on environmental issues. He has more than a decade of experience in public administration and procedural law. So welcome, Marco. Octavio Rosas Landa, who unfortunately could not make it personally, but he's with us online. He had some travel issues. He's professor of economics at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM, and he's founding member of the National Assembly of Environmentally Affected. He has an MA in geography and has a very solid background on EJ, and we're Very pleased to have him with us today. So welcome, Octavio. So let's talk about EJ. Let's get going. And I'm going to get ahead of myself and say that I'm going to close with a link between EJ and Isaac Newton. So you think about that for a moment, and I'm going to get back to that at some point. But there is a link, and a very important one for everyone here. So as many of you know, we've been doing a deep dive on EJ and its evolution, its history, and the term EJ, or the reference to EJ as a social movement and as public policy. And we're also thinking about EJ as an aspiration for affected communities, especially underserved and disadvantaged communities or discriminated communities. We've looked at EJ in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico. We've looked at environmental justice through a human rights lens, because sometimes that's the way you need to think about environmental justice. And we've looked at it through the evolution of human rights law and environmental treaties and agreements. And that's where we start discovering the relevance of EJ internationally, particularly, for example, the Rio Convention, Principle 10, access to information, participation, and access to justice. These are procedural pillars of EJ that have become universally accepted and which many groups around the world are working on. And while there is no single definition, it's not like you're going to go on some great website or go to our website or go to some of the academia on EJ and find the perfect definition. There are many definitions, but what's really interesting is that just saying those two words to anyone, even if they know nothing about environmental justice, they have a sense of what it is. And what it is, and I've heard it here many times already, it's the other side of the coin. It's when you don't have it that you understand it. It's about environmental injustice. So injustice, environmental injustice, is what leads us to act to achieve environmental justice. The word itself, or the term, it goes back to the 70s, 60s even. There were already some articles about workers affected by toxic pollution in their workplace. And the idea at the time was that these workers needed access to information about why they were getting sick. They wanted to know. They wanted to know what risks they were facing. They wanted health care. The right to know, the right to information. They wanted standards. They wanted enforcement of law, and they wanted reparations. They wanted compensation for their illnesses. This is where the beginnings of the environmental justice movement occurred. And we need, and this issue of history has come up a lot. We need to understand the context of when this happened. Let's remember 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's when the world finally got around to saying, we can't exploit people. The civil rights movement in the US came right after the UN Declaration, and the EJ movement could not delay much longer than that. It really is contextualized by an awakening of the importance of human rights, civil and political rights, yes, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And as we start fighting globally for human rights, and sometimes we associate the EJ movement to the United States, but really around the world, human rights and economic, social, and cultural rights and civil rights really take front and center. And that's around the time when terms like environmental equity and later environmental racism, thank you, Dr. Chavez, appear. And this wasn't necessarily about environment, it was about pollution. Environmental justice movement wasn't focusing on protecting lakes or forests. It was focused on people getting sick and dying. And that's why it distinguished itself from the more traditional environmental movement. And so really people and human health are at the heart of the environmental justice movement. And when we got together in 1991, thank you also, Dr. Chavez, for organizing that event. We have a few other people in the room even that were at that event. Gail, thank you very much for being there. Sarah, you were there as well. Please stand up. Let's remember our leaders. Let's remember our leaders. And that came up in the youth panel before. You're not working alone. You're building off generations of people fighting for these rights. So EJ is about that history and about that evolution. This panel is about 3 countries that are trying to look at EJ through a common lens. I mentioned yesterday at the JPAC forum the 4 Ps: people, place, pollution, and policy. And those 4 Ps look very different in each of the countries, even though we have some of the same issues, even though we have some of the same problems, even though we have some of the same struggles and the same advocacy and the same concerns from our governments about inequities or about environmental pollution, but they do look similar. But as we become more interconnected through technology, through Facebook, through social media and TikTok, we are also becoming more socially diverse, and we're becoming more tolerant and more educated. And so injustice becomes less acceptable. And this is part of what we're doing today. So all these things that we're seeing today, climate justice and energy justice, indigenous justice, gender justice, disability justice, youth justice, intergenerational justice, immigrant justice. These are issues that are all being looked at through an EJ lens because the way that we are communicating is interconnected. And so this is what the intersectional nature of EJ is all about. We heard that yesterday from Deandra. So EJ will take on very different directions and it will cross different issues. And this is what this panel is also trying to get at. Where are we going with EJ? We may not call it EJ in every struggle, in every space, in every community, in every country, in every society, but if it's about equity, it's about fairness, if it's about non-discrimination of environmental resources and pollution, you can be sure it's about EJ. So we need to understand all of these dimensions and how it's playing out. So I'm going to close. Still haven't mentioned Isaac Newton, but I'm going to go back to Isaac Newton and Isaac Newton's law of inertia. Do we remember that law? The law of inertia says that if something is put in motion, it will continue in the same direction unless a force acts upon it to change its direction. Think about that. If something is moving in a certain direction, you can't expect it to change directions unless you have a force changing that direction. We must act if we want to change the direction of environmental injustice. And you are the force of action. Thank you. Good. Is my mic working? There it is. Fantastic. So that sets us up for a discussion that I think will be very, very interesting. We've already said a lot of things, so we don't need to go back and go over about what environmental justice is. My first question, and I'd like to throw it over to Dr. Chavis. Where are we today? You've seen this for so many years. You're talking to young people, you're talking to academics, you're talking to the activists. We see what is going on with EPA and with the administrator and all. Where are we today with environmental justice after all of this fight that's been going on for 40, 50 years already?
Well, we've made tremendous progress. I always want to note the progress that we've made because you don't want to struggle to struggle. You want to struggle to win something. You want to struggle to create an improvement in the quality of life of the communities in which we represent. So as I look back over the last 50, 60 years, I see progress. But one thing about progress, there's always a counter to the progress. So every inch of progress you've made, there's been a couple of inches of repression by the forces of injustice. When we cry for justice, freedom, and equality, it presupposes that there's injustice, inequality, and inequity. So I'm not going to predominate this panel. I'm going to let the other panel, I will end with this. The number one progress that I see we've made is that we've gone beyond tolerating one another to embracing one another. This conference could not have been possible 50 years ago because we were all defensive. Our knowledge was very poor, or sometimes no knowledge about our native indigenous people. And to some extent, they're revisionists out here now. There's a group in Washington, D.C. called the Heritage Foundation, where they spend millions of dollars doing ahistorical, apolitical, acultural research. They want to deny the genocide of Native people. They want to deny the enslavement of African people. They want to deny that California, Arizona, and New Mexico and Texas were once part of Mexico. So part of the reckoning is that we have to challenge these revisionists. And that's why I'm hoping that the CEC will help establish a trilateral institution that we can raise millions of dollars to challenge this false, fake history. I never thought I would live to see a term called alternative truth. There's no such thing as alternative truth. It's either a lie or it's the truth. And we have to, we got work to do. We got to roll up our sleeves based on the progress, because young people want to get involved in a movement that not only will make a difference, but a movement that has made a difference. And so how we inspire and pass that baton to the next generation, we have to make sure that we hand the baton of history. We hand the baton of embracing one another across these borders known as Canada, United States, and Mexico. And let me just say this, it's more than Canada, United States, and Mexico. We would fail if we don't deal with South America also. And we would fail if we don't deal with the rest of the world. Environmental justice is a global term that started in many, many local communities around the world.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. And I'm going to jump right to Canada because, wow, you have this law, this new law after a decade of trying to make that law happen. And you also have the benefit of 40 years of trial and error that we've seen in the US. We have Mexico with an agency that works on environmental justice. What is Canada thinking right now with this new law? What are the opportunities? Where do you see this moving with the benefit of hindsight to what we've seen already on each end?
Well, I think that there's a lot to look at here, but really, I think Canada right now, to go into a little bit of detail, last week, legislation requiring the development of a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism and to advance environmental justice actually became law, meaning that they cannot be turned over. So one of the most important pieces that exists there is actually that there's an ongoing component. The strategy, you have to demonstrate every 5 years, you must do assess the progress of your strategy. You need to table the next strategy that will be for the next 5 years after that. And then also making sure that we're demonstrating the progress throughout. But I do think one of the big pieces to recognize here is this law actually came from grassroots organizations. 10 years of their efforts to get this law passed. And it's really not common that a piece of legislation that's originated at grassroots level comes forward. So, and it also takes a lot for to help, I would guess, decision makers and legislators to actually see that your concern is their concern as well. So this is a big win right now in the space of environmental justice in Canada specifically, and I think a very exciting time as well.
Thank you, Amanda. Let's go to Mexico. I'd like to hear the Profepa's view after so many years of thinking about access to justice on environmental matters and how the Profepa in Mexico views environmental justice.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to collaborate here at that important forum. I represent Profepa, who is the instance of environmental justice persecution. And then I continue in Spanish. Efectivamente,
the Profepa is in charge of being able to carry out the two basic bases of the Mexican laws. We are very aware that we had to take, in this sense, the right to two important elements: one, healthy environment, and access to justice. But these two elements cannot be carried out if we are not aware of the indigenous communities, which are part and which on a daily basis shows us which is a basic what is the basic importance of their spaces, of their lands. And if we don't see this as administrators of the government, as officials of the government, they cannot permeate as they should be. So we are very aware that access to justice in a healthy environment has to be in collaboration with all, and that we should have natural resources, protect natural resources, and revise industries with all the necessary elements in order to carry out the common purpose that all of us are looking for as a community, which is to conserve those areas as well as possible.
I'd like to ask Ariel, is there such a thing as indigenous environmental justice? Is that somehow different from EJ as we get it? Or looking back to the 1991 summit, there were a lot of indigenous people present that co-developed the 17 principles. There was a spirit of collaboration. Where does the indigenous dimension of EJ come in?
I think when you start to deconstruct some of the definitions that are coming out around environmental justice, you start to see this divergence of where indigenous environmental justice starts to come up. Whereas environmental justice in the frameworks that we're discussing primarily in this forum looks at policy reform. So reforming and tweaking and or fixing colonial systems and structures that we currently exist within. The difference between a lot of indigenous movements that are working alongside and within the environmental justice movement are actually looking for autonomy, sovereignty, and self-determination as defined more wholly within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this is where we start to see this divergence, because a lot of indigenous communities are not interested in tweaking and fixing colonial structures, but are looking at bolstering and building up their own independent, sovereign, autonomous governance, policies, laws, and legislation for their own communities. Because for the last 500 plus years, indigenous peoples have been living under the repression and oppression of colonial systems and structures. We heard from from some of the indigenous youth panelists that stated that some of the policies and laws and legislations and agreements that are already in place to uphold environmental justice in places like Mexico have not actually had substantive changes into their own communities. And we're seeing this. So I think the biggest divergence is we're not necessarily always interested in tweaking colonial systems and governments and policies and law, but that doesn't mean we're not participating. For me, I see that as a stopgap measure or a mitigation. We're mitigating those impacts through colonial systems, but we're also advancing our own. Secondarily, I think it's really important to understand when we talk about the global north and the global south, we often forget about the fact that there isn't just a global north and a global south. We have the south of the north, and we have the north of the south, as in people that live within the global north, but are living within conditions that are the same as the global north. And many indigenous peoples in North America live within the conditions of what would be defined as the global south, but we are living in the global north. And so while representation and procedural justice and corrective justice and social justice are important, autonomy and self-determination as being advanced by many indigenous peoples is one. The secondary piece that makes a little bit of a difference within this is our relationships with where we come from. I am Dene, and the word Dene, when you break it down, means to flow from the earth. We are people that have relationships. We are caribou people. We have interrelationships with the places that have defined who we are as people. And when we talk about environmental justice, we are talking about, at least in my territory, justice for the caribou, justice for the river systems, justice for the plants and the medicines and the trees. And it is not that we are separate from those things, but we are one and the same. When we protect the caribou, we protect ourselves. When we protect the quality of life for the caribou, it protects the quality of life for who we are. When the animals and the land is sick, we are sick. And there's this different correlation that decenters humanity from the Indigenous environmental justice perspective and recenters the collective interrelationships of species from the Indigenous environmental justice piece. I'm not saying that we are completely and wholly different, but there is just a nuance of difference that makes it slightly different because we want to operate outside and create alternative futures to the futures and colonial capitalist systems that we have been locked into for the last 500 plus years.
Thank you, Ariel. You know, it's interesting because as you speak, I recall conversations with folks like Nello Charles, who's here with us today, of the Canadian Coalition for Climate and Environmental Justice, or Ingrid Waldron. But I also recall conversations with youth who talk about alternative solutions, alternative systems. And they also, Ingrid and Charles, talk a lot about place and how it's important and the relationship to place, not only place in terms of where pollution is, but place in terms of where you live and what makes you who you are. Before I turn to Octavio to ask him about Mexico, I'm going to stay on the Indigenous side and invite Kenneth to reflect. What's it like at EPA with such a strong push on environmental justice and your role with Indian tribes and how that's playing out? I'd love to hear how that's working out and how we're bringing in the Indigenous perspective to environmental issues.
Well, thank you for the question. And I think it's a very important question because I did want to talk about inclusion today. And representation, because I think it's critical to the conversations that we have in those rooms where we're developing policy. From a personal experience, I've worked for the federal government for about 20 years now, whether it's been in the United States Senate or at the United States Department of Transportation or currently at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I have been oftentimes the only Indigenous person in the room. And I can definitely represent my thoughts on the matter, but Indigenous people are not one. You know, I can't speak for Athabascans or other Native nations across the United States, but it's critically important to these conversations that we're having every day, that representation. So when I hear things, I guess. Let me stop for a second there and regather my thoughts. It's been a little bit of a difficult journey, I'll say that, to be quite honest with you. But that doesn't mean that we can't forge a path forward. So I think trying to use steal a phrase from Ariel here, the colonial constructs that we have, the way that we're built, to use that system to incorporate Native voices and incorporate Indigenous aspects into our work at EPA, I think is something that we should continue to strive for. So I think it's been a challenge, but I think honestly, increasing that representation and increasing that Indigenous voice in our policymaking, not just at EPA, but across the federal government in the United States, and I'm sure for Canada and Mexico, but also across our legislatures, all throughout the government, we need to have that voice. So I probably could go on and talk about inclusion for hours, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that reflection. Now I will turn over to Octavio. And so my question for you, you work on mapping conflict and understanding, and we get back to this issue of place and where the conflict is, but it can also be where resources are or where communities live, where industry is, and maps play an important role. And even the Mexican government recognizes and officially has maps about where conflict is. So this is one way to understand this issue. And very important that we do that. Octavio, what has been your experience with environmental justice? You're one of the people I know that straddles both geographical spaces and theories very well. You understand the EJ concept in the US. You also understand it very well in Mexico. Some of your thoughts on place and conflict, geography, and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very relevant question. Not only because local communities are experiencing the environmental injustices in real time in their local spaces. It is also because that they also experience them locally, but also connected to the global economy, because most of these environmental or socio-environmental conflicts that are occurring in places, in countries like mine, in Mexico, are related to things that happen between governments or agreements between governments and corporations, such as the free trade agreement, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, that was called NAFTA before. And in the years that the neoliberal governments ruled in Mexico, we managed to account for over 210 environmental conflicts in our territory. This means that the legal systems that are in place right now in Mexico, that have been in place for decades now, are insufficient to bring environmental justice or to open a path for local communities to address these issues and resolve them whenever there is a Canadian mining company or an American pharmaceutical or chemical company discharging pollutants in rivers. So this for us means one of the issues that is most urgent and present, that there are many obstacles so far for local communities to address in the national and international level every aspect of the environmental injustice that they are facing. So this is one of the things that are most important right now, because for us the solution involves the local communities. There is no solution. There is a saying from the Wixárika people in the western part of Mexico who say that if the solution is not collective, it is not a solution. So this has to involve local communities, and this has to involve not only academia and also the authorities, the Profepa or Semarnat in Mexico, and other agencies such as the CCA or CEC, and of course the EPA and the Canadian authorities. So this is a very important issue that we need to address alongside to bring environmental justice to all the affected communities.
And you started a movement.
Yes, we started the National Assembly of Environmentally Affected Peoples that started in 2008, and we held over 10 assemblies, and we organized the Mexican chapter of the Permanent People's Tribunal, the tribunal that was founded by Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. And we brought it to Mexico, and we exposed all the environmental devastation and injustices to local communities here in Mexico.
Thank you, Octavio. So I want to point now to Gail and Sarah and Dr. Chavis. In 1991, you started us going. So now we got to deal with keep going, right? And my question is, back then, you started international collaboration on EJ, and it was about getting the issue visibility and starting the process. Well, now we've gone several decades, and it's the next chapter. What's in that chapter? What do we have to do, and what can we do? And this is our most important question on this panel. What can we do next as three countries, as a space where we're coming together to have these sorts of conversations? But then we got to go out and do the next thing. It doesn't stop here, right? So what's the message?
Well, I recall that none of us went and asked our government's permission.
Okay,
We
that's a
decided
start.
that we're gonna have this meeting. And it turned out to be fruitful, productive, with long-range impact. And I think sometimes indigenous people, grassroots people, we want to get government sanction of what we do. I think the government ought to get sanction from indigenous people. We got to flip this script. Because a lot of times, if you allow public policy only to come from a government down to the people, the interest of the people does not get served in terms of change. But when it comes from the grassroots up, and we start getting people from the grassroots into government, to change government, to transform it, then you have a greater chance of success. Why do I say that? Because the answer to the question now in 2024, we have to build and continue to build a movement that is more powerful than the resistance to the movement. By how we communicate, we should be using technology to our benefit. In 1991, we didn't have anybody's email address. You know, I didn't have anybody's cell number.
You had faxes.
We had faxes.
I remember
but
that.
Everybody didn't have a fax. You know, what we had was word of mouth from trusted sources. Trust is a very important factor in building any movement. And I think that in the context of CEC, I think that the documents, the proposals that are recommended and commended trilaterally should always be written from a perspective of the communities that will be most effective. Lastly, I think that I'm for some reason, I would like to see the major academic institutions in Canada, the major academic institutions in the United States, the major academic institutions in Mexico. We need to have a consortium. I mean, look, I keep saying this, we have to out-publish, we have to out-content produce, we have to out-distribute the forces that are arrayed against us. You know, this is a fight. And we have to make sure that I'm in the fight to win. I'm not in the fight just to have a fight. And I think that one of the things we have to do at meetings like this is be strategic. So we all agree, what are we going to do after this meeting to the next meeting and measure how we make the progress. I think young people would rally if they saw an action plan that's inclusive. And also to learn from, we're not trying to, how can I say it? Redesign colonialism. When Mandela came out of prison in South Africa, he wasn't trying to reform apartheid. It had to be dismantled. And so to a certain extent, we all know, although we don't talk about it too much, the economic systems that contribute to our suffering at some point have to be dismantled.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. Ariel, what do we do? What's our next step? Concise, because they're pushing us to move, but we're going to keep the conversation going.
I mean, I feel like I just want to echo what was just said. Like we need to be moving away from looking for like the continuation of representation and visibility is critical. We need that, but it has to be a step towards our liberation, which requires the decolonization and the dismantling of these systems and structures. Environmental justice as a framework or an ideology is part of the tools in the tool shed. It's not the goal. The goal is for us to have not reform, but new systems that are equitable for everybody. And I think that we have a real problem in the current structures where we have these antiquated systems that are maintaining unequal and unjust relationships with Indigenous and Black communities and other people of color communities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And these are things like the doctrine of discovery, the domestic dependent nationhood, the trust doctrine, the plenary power doctrine, and all these other archaic structures that are the foundations of the legal frameworks we exist in. And unless we are talking about dismantling the foundations of this country, no tweaking of the system is going to work. Secondarily, I think what's really important is absolutely, we don't need permission. I think one of the craziest things is in Canada right now, if you want to become a sovereign nation state, the government has to say, okay, we agree with your sovereignty. It's wild that you have to ask for permission from the government for your own sovereignty in your own homelands. But within that context, we have to be writing our relationships with each other and the land and with our spirits. And as Indigenous peoples, I think one of the foundational things that has brought our people together in times of great crisis has been ceremony that reconnects us, not just with our relationships with each other, but our relationships with our kin and the lands and spirits. And I think that has to be included in our steps towards mitigating the crises we're all in and finding new pathways for future generations.
Thank you, Ariel. I'm going to go to Octavio online. One idea of what we do next.
We need to create different ways in which to collaborate between government agencies, academia, and local communities or grassroots organizations. This is a crucial part of the process because we need to design trajectories for resolving or solving the problems that we have inherited from other periods in our history. So this is a very important issue. And right now we have a lot of people interested in collaborating. So I think this is one step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Octavio. I'm going to stay with Mexico. Let's hear from Profepa.
From my responsibility as a public official, it is very clear, and I've seen it through this forum, that we have to be very responsible with the Indigenous communities and the communities that will allow us for the public policies to reach the objective that we are looking for. It's worthless to have public policy implemented with people from the academia, with scientists, if we don't touch the basis and the roots of what we really need in each one of the communities. That is from my perspective as a public officer. As a person, I have all this knowledge. I'm very moved by all the stories that you have here in North America, in the three countries. We are a community, we are neighbors, we are brothers and sisters, and to contribute my grain of salt in this sense, to transmit all the knowledge that I have acquired in this great forum, and to be able to take this to future generations, but especially to this one, because the future begins with the present, and we are the present that has to start creating the basis that we have to implement the basis like Dr. Chavez did. Thank you very much.
I want to go to the EPA. What's our next step?
Well, and I think it was, and I'm going to be very succinct here, and I think Dr. Chavez said this earlier today, is that when we get together, it has the potential to do good things. And I think that the next step is just, for me, is to continue the dialogue and figure out ways that we can use policy to incorporate, use our policymakers to achieve our goals.
Thank you, Kenneth. And the inspiration with Canada's new law. How you see, you're listening to so many things and so many ideas, and you're about to develop your EJ strategy and your consultation. What are you taking away with you in terms of priorities, and how are you going to meet this challenge?
Well, I think the answer is pretty clear, actually. Federal government doesn't own this space at all. They do not own the environmental justice movement. And it's about going back to those people that are actually impacted and those ones that are experiencing those burdens. ensuring that those voices and those stories and the lived experience comes to the decision-making table, and that is informing decisions that are being made. And I have to say, we saw success of that through Amjinong First Nation when we were supporting them in their urgent, acute issue of the air pollution. Really important that we bring those stories to the table, but also that we recognize that, you know, everybody has to start somewhere, and allowing people to have that opportunity to be educated, not just people externally, but internally as well within the government structures, decision-making bodies at all jurisdictional levels. It is about an education piece, and everyone must be educated. But again, recognizing that Indigenous lands don't know colonial boundaries. So really recognizing and taking some of those pieces out of it, and small tweaks will not work. It's about changing our processes. This is about reform at large.
Supposed to have another half hour of discussion, so I'm going to give my panelists extra tasks. You find them, talk to them, give them ideas, and they're going to get back to me with their further reflections. And it's unfair because I've been chatting with them already a while, so I've heard them and heard many more ideas. But this really is an effort to get your opinion and have all of us think about ways forward. We're going to keep working on EJ. I said it yesterday at the JPAC panel, put EJ and CEC into your Google search. We're going to be doing a lot more work, a lot more trilateral work, a lot more publishing, collaboration with academics, with experts, with activists, with communities. And we hope that through that collaboration, we can write that next chapter. So thank you, everyone. I have a few administrative things to do, but first I'd like a round of applause for our experts. And I want to thank our hosts, the United States, for bringing us to Wilmington and to have this council session focused on environmental justice. It's not over. We got a lot more. We're going to the open ceremony. I'm supposed to tell you a few last messages. Keep your badges. Don't get rid of them. You're going to need them to go to the reception. There's a bus leaving at 5:45. It doesn't wait. So please get to it. And make sure to be back here at 10 a.m. tomorrow in this room for the continuation of council session. Thank you, everyone, for participating today in this expert roundtable.